let's take a look at the Reds in 2025, and let's talk about, Nick, your biggest key for the Reds' success in 2025.
Well, as always, your biggest key is probably just your starting pitching health.
Oh,
but that's
okay.
such a dumb,
very specific
thing to say. It's a dumb thing to say. I mean, it's boring. So I'm going to say something that I do think is very, very important, but I don't think anyone would ever mention is the biggest key. But I legitimately think it is up there at the top, towards the top of your biggest keys towards the Reds. And Craig, my biggest key for the Cincinnati Reds in 2025 is the St. Louis Cardinals. Period.
You have to give an explanation here, Nick.
Oh, you want an explanation? I can't just
say. I don't think you can just leave it there. I don't think.
Okay. So, how bad are the St. Louis Cardinals going to be in 2025? That is the biggest one of the biggest keys for the Reds. We know the Cardinals don't have a great roster right now, but they're still, I think, betting odds are have them ahead of the Pirates at 4th. But we know they're trying to go through a rebuild. They're trying to restructure their whole organization. Mozeliak's leaving. Chaim Bloom's replacing him. They're trying to get rid of contracts. They feel very, maybe not, I don't think they're going to be as dire as the 2022 Reds, but they feel very 2022 Reds right now with where they're at. So we know they want to trade Arenado. They want to trade Sonny Gray. They may want to trade Contreras, Helsley. Will they do that before the season, or will they do that at the deadline? That kind of remains to be seen. But if they trade all those guys, I mean, the Reds play, I believe it's 13 times. I think that's what the number was last year. He played the St. Louis Cardinals 13 times. Remember last year what the Reds did against really bad teams? Craig, the Reds went 17-3 against the Rockies, the Marlins, the White Sox, and the Angels. 17-3. I mean, they absolutely dominate. And there's no guarantee that just because a team's really bad and just because a team's really, really good that it's going to result in wins, but the likelihood is a lot better. And you look at the AL Central last year. Chicago White Sox went 12-1 against the White Sox. The Kansas City Royals went 12-1 against the Chicago White Sox. Tigers went 10-3. Both those teams, they only won 86 games. I mean, you do the math there, 12-1. You put that at 500, that's a 500 team overall. So the NL Central kind of gets this rep as a bad division. It's not a great division. It's certainly, you don't have to deal with a team like the Dodgers, or you don't have to deal with Juan Soto. But there wasn't any bad teams in the NL Central in 2024. The Pirates, who finished last, Craig, they were buyers at the trade deadline. I mean, this was a competitive division top to bottom, and that kind of makes it harder to get enough wins to sneak into a wild card. And so if the Cardinals are really, really bad, that really, I think, increases the Reds' chance, because if the Reds could go something like 10-3 or, man, even, 11-2 against the Cardinals and just rack up wins against a really, really bad team, especially if they trade a bunch of pieces. Remember the 2022 Reds in the second half, how bad that team was at the end of the year. Could the Cardinals be that bad? If they are, I think it really, really could help the Reds' playoff chances.
It's interesting, Nick. You look at Vegas's win-loss totals for teams in the NL this year, and you bring, it's an interesting point. I don't know how much I can call that a key for the Reds, but you look at the NL Central win-loss totals this year. Obviously, the Cubs projected to win the NL Central, but at 85.5 wins, both the NL West and the NL East both have 3 teams projected to win 85.5 games or more in 2025. You look at the NL West, which you mentioned, the Dodgers are projected 103.5 wins, but then the Padres at 89.5 and the Diamondbacks at 85.5. Then you look at the NL East, and you've got 3 teams all projected to win 91.5 or more. The Mets at 91.5, the Phillies at 91.5, and the Braves at 93.5. Both of those teams both of those divisions ultimately really going to kind of beat up on each other. I think you've got 3 good teams in each of those divisions. Obviously, the NL East with the Nationals and Marlins, they're going to pick up some wins there. The NL West with the Rockies, but even the Giants projected to win 79.5 this year. But you look at the NL Central, the Cubs, as I mentioned, 85.5, the Brewers 82.5. The Reds come in at third at 78.5, then the Pirates at 76.5, and the Cardinals, at least currently, sitting at 75.5 wins. So, it is interesting, and certainly the division will play a part in the Reds' success this year. But I'm going to be looking for something else in 2025, Nick. And I think ultimately what it comes down to is you got to focus on your internals. You can't be focused on what happens outside within the division. You got to be focused on what you can handle. And for me, the thing that is going to really define 2025 is the development of these young players on the Cincinnati Reds. You've got guys in 2024 who, quite frankly, just didn't live up to expectations. Obviously, CES struggled in the limited opportunities he got, then got injured. He's obviously a key part of the 2025 success. We have talked ad nauseum of the struggles that Noelvi Marte has had ever since his suspension. That's a big piece. And even I'm going to throw out an older guy in Jeimer Candelario, who, quite frankly, in 2024 was nowhere near the level of expectation that many had for him. And so you look across the board at the number of players who didn't progress or even took a step back. And I think ultimately that's what led to the change in leadership with the Cincinnati Reds, and quite frankly why they went with Terry Francona, because he's going to be developing these young guys. Ellie De La Cruz has to take yet another step forward in order for this Reds team to be successful in 2025. Yeah, the starting pitching, the health, all of that matters. But ultimately, none of it matters if your young players can't step into the roles that are expected of them. And for me, that ultimately is going to determine whether or not this Reds team is competing to win 85 games or they're down in the 75 win range with those Cardinals that you just mentioned. I know you're really high on guys like CES and the power that they can bring to this Reds lineup, and may even be one of the reasons why the Reds aren't going out and adding power other places. But I mean, if you had to pinpoint one guy, I think I just said the answer for you. But if you pinpoint one guy to take that next step, who is it?
We also want to remind you that you can call or text 988 anytime, day or night. The 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is a place to get support for anything related to mental health. Whether it's an immediate crisis, simply wanting to find out how to connect with care, or anything in between, it's a 100% confidential, secure, and anonymous way to reach out for help when you don't know where else to turn. To connect, call or text 988 or visit mantherapy.org to get help. It's okay not to be okay. I mean, CES has been my guy. I mean,
Yeah,
he did, absolutely nothing last year, but you look at just some of the projections, even with how bad he was last year, they're still really high. This is a guy that matched at every single level in the minor leagues. So, and in his first season in the big leagues, hit very well. So I just think he's a lot more proven in terms of like how consistent he's been at every level. And I think eventually that pays off. I still think Matt McLain's health, just if he's on the field, is still probably even more important than CES, just because he's a projected almost 4-win player. And I mean, Brian Kenny, I think, had him number 3 in terms of his top 10 second baseman. And you look at the list and you're like, that's not really that crazy. I mean, if he's healthy, he is a top 5 second baseman in the sport. And that's just health-wise. CES, I believe in him, but he doesn't have that, kind of pedigree or whatever you want to call it yet. So, yeah, I don't know, Craig. I look at this Fangraph starting lineup and I go, this isn't that bad. It went bad in 2024. The platoons were a disaster, worst case scenario for so many of them. But right now they have Gavin Lux hitting 9th. They have CES hitting 8th. Candelario hitting 7th. There's not the superstar outside of Ellie De La Cruz. There's not anyone that I think is a for sure bona fide, well above average hitter. But there also isn't any of those 9 guys that I go are terrible hitters. There's something to be said about continuity in a lineup. And if the Reds can have go back here. If in some cases, I think it can be better, and there's been a couple good studies on this. It can be better to have 7, 8 hitters that are league average and slightly above than 3 star hitters and a bunch of nobodies around them. That's what the 2012 Reds was just 3 guys that could hit, and they were able to make it work. But if you have a long lineup, it can really lead to a lot of run production. And that's kind of what I think you're banking on the most with the Reds. And again, there's a lot of guys that have to stay healthy for that to happen. But I think the lineup's a lot better than it's given credit for.
Well, let's talk about one more thing. And this is the thing that I look back on 2024, and I think it's really what ultimately derailed the season. And I don't know how much of it falls on David Bell. I don't know how much of it falls on Nick Krall. Maybe you have some insight into it, but ultimately, this Reds team was an average ball club a majority of the season. You know, if you look at their record month by month, they were above 500 in 4 of the 6 months of the season. The thing that really bit them in 2024 was in May. And in May, they were 9-18, and that was highlighted by a stretch where David Bell was really handcuffed, and he was essentially playing with 10 healthy guys on the roster. I think one of the things that 2025 is going to rely on is what I'll call roster management. And it's not only just like managing the guys that are on the roster today, but you know, in situations like that, injuries are going to happen. It's a 162 game season. It's bound to happen. You're going to have to go and bring guys up from the minors, pull guys from your 40 man up to the show. And what you can't have is guys like Blake Dunn did last year, like our guy Jacob Hurtubise did last year. You can't have those depth pieces come up and struggle. And, you know, the Reds have done a lot to add flexibility to their roster, it feels, so that when that happens, they have a guy on the major league roster ready to slot in. But ultimately, a big piece of the success for 2025 is going to be those guys who are called up for the 1 to 2 to 3 week stints when injuries happen and they need someone to plug in. Because you can't have guys come up and hit 098 over a 3 week stretch because you don't have somebody else.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, look, right now, if you're just looking at Fangraphs, now they have Cooper Bowman projected in the Reds roster, but which I actually don't think is as crazy as maybe a lot of people think. I mean, it was a Rule 5 pick. You're going to want to give him a look. There's a reason they picked them up and paid the $100,000 for that. But you have Noelvi Marte and Will Benson currently projected in AAA. So those guys were players that everyone loved 10 months ago, and they fell out of order quickly, and a lot of it for good reason. But I'm not giving up on either one of those guys. And then you still have a lot of guys behind them, and Blake Dunn, Hurtubise, Hines, Tyler Callahan that I mentioned that have some upside. So you don't need all these guys to hit. You just need a couple of them to be able to provide some value. Yeah, I mean, I'd love for the Reds to go out and add Randall Grichuk, and then you push everyone down one leg. I don't think adding Randall Grichuk is as big of a deal for your healthy lineup. It's a bigger deal for your unhealthy lineup. And that's what we saw in May. But ultimately, Craig, look, the Reds had a positive run differential last year. They were atrocious, 15-28 in one-run games, some of it to their own doing. But the Reds, same team the year before, had a winning record with a negative run differential. And it wasn't just because of the April without everyone called up. If you look at it just from the time they called up Ellie De La Cruz, I think they still had a negative run differential. And so I think some of it will bounce back. You look at that stretch you're talking about, Craig, some tough luck in that, man. Like, they had games where they lost games. They scored 5 runs. They scored 5 runs. And then they had like 5 other games where they allowed less than 5 runs. 3, 2, 4, 2, 2, 4, 3, all in that big stretch. So like you just have some of these games kind of sync up a little bit better and you have a little bit better luck, and you're all of a sudden adding up wins. I don't think this team, I think that people got way too high on the 2023 Reds. They overachieved and people gave them a little bit, put them on a higher pedestal, myself included to a degree. But I think they're doing the same thing in reverse from last year. They're too low on the results. And they're somewhere in the middle, and I think they have gotten a little bit better, and they still have a lot of young players that still can get better.
All right, so let's wrap this up with your projection for 2025. I know there's still a lot of time and things can obviously change, but I mentioned before Vegas has the Reds projected at 78.5 wins. You putting money on the over or the under, Nick?
I mean, I would definitely put money on the over. I'm not a Satanist, Craig. I mean, I don't know who would put money on the under on that. Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of crazy. If I'm looking at this team, I just think that, again, everything went wrong and they still won 76 last year. I think they're there. The question is, I just don't know if this is a low 80 win team or a 90 win team. I think that depending on how things go, there's just a lot of fluctuation with this team. But as always, I'm excited to find out. And I get a lot of people are down right now, Craig, but just would say 78.5 wins may not feel like a lot. And I don't know the exact number on this, but over the last 30 years as a Reds fan, how many teams were actually at 78.5 going into the season? And that was before, and that wasn't with the current format where 7 teams in the National League get in the playoffs. So I think there's a lot of reason to have hope, and I'm just excited to roll out the ball and see what happens.
We will see what happens indeed when the season starts on March 28th. That's going to do it for today's episode of Chatterbox Reds. For Nick Kirby, I'm Craig Sandlin. We appreciate you tuning in. Be sure to stay tuned to Chatterbox Sports for all the latest breaking news. Until then, for Nick Kirby, I'm Craig Sandlin. Appreciate you all tuning in. Go Reds.